Inside the private ICU wing of Knight Memorial Hospital, a silent cluster of specialists circled the bed of a man who had never known what it felt like to be powerless. Monitors blinked amber warnings. A crash cart stood open nearby. The wall clock ticked too loudly for a room that cost $10,000 a night. Mayor Maxwell Knight, billionaire power broker, the man whose name was bolted above the hospital's main entrance, lay diminished beneath a web of wires and tubes. His color was wrong. His breathing was shallow. His hands, which had signed off on mergers and city budgets and one very important legal suppression order, lay still at his sides. Dr. Julian Vane checked the chart again. Then checked it again. His team moved with the careful, quickening urgency of people who were running out of ideas but not yet willing to say so out loud. Then a sound cut through the ward. The quiet scrape of a mop bucket stopping in the corridor. A woman in a stained blue uniform stood outside the glass partition. She was not looking at Maxwell Knight. She was looking at the monitors. Her eyes, steady, sharp, and reading something the doctors had missed, moved across the data with the focused calm of someone who had seen this pattern before, who had written about this pattern before. She had grease on her collar, gray work gloves on her hands, a hospital ID badge that said maintenance point. One of the junior nurses noticed her. "Hey, you can't be in this section." The woman didn't move. Dr. Vane looked up. His expression shifted from dismissal to irritation. Security. Two guards stepped toward the corridor door. Maxwell Knight's eyes opened. He turned his head, slowly, with effort, toward the glass. He saw the woman in the blue uniform. Something moved across his face that was not confusion and was not surprise. It was older than both. His cracked lips parted. "Wait," he said. His voice was barely a thread. But it was enough. The guards stopped. Dr. Vane stared at his patient. "Sir, you need to conserve. Wait." Maxwell's eyes didn't leave the woman outside the glass. "Let her speak." A ripple of disbelief moved through the medical team. A nurse exchanged a glance with the anesthesiologist. Someone almost said something. Nobody did. The door opened. Elias Thorne took one step into the room. She did not look at Dr. Vane. She did not look at the nurses or the crash cart or the rank certificates on the wall. She looked only at the monitors, then at the 4-line, then at the medication log clipped to the foot of the bed. Her jaw tightened. "Dr. Vane," she said, her voice low and even, "when did you start him on the potassium protocol?" Vane's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, who exactly are you?" She didn't answer him. She stepped closer to the 4-stand, reached for the medication chart with a gloved hand, and read it the way someone reads a sentence they already know ends badly. "There," she said quietly. "That's the interaction. It's the supplement combination he was already taking. Combined with this dosage sequence," she traced the line with one finger, "it creates a cascade. It looks like cardiac failure. It isn't." Vane's voice went cold and sharp. "You are a janitor." Elias Thorne looked up from the chart. She looked directly at Dr. Julian Vane for the first time. Her eyes were entirely, devastatingly calm. "I know what I'm looking at," she said. From the bed, barely audible, Maxwell Knight spoke again. "If you trust me, I can help." He was repeating her words back to her, words she hadn't said yet in this room, but that he had clearly been waiting for a very long time to hear. The monitors screamed a new alarm. Nobody moved. Then Dr. Vane slowly stepped aside, and Elias Thorne moved to the bedside. Nobody noticed Elias Thorne. That was the point. She had spent 3 years perfecting the particular art of moving through Knight Memorial Hospital like furniture. Present, functional, and invisible. She knew which corridor tiles squeaked under pressure and avoided them. She knew which nurses ate lunch at their stations and which ones abandoned their posts. She knew the shift rotations, the supply schedules, The precise 40-minute window each evening when the fourth-floor private wing emptied enough that a woman pushing a mop bucket could stand near a patient's open doorway and listen to a monitor readout without anyone asking why. She had learned to make herself small. She had learned it the hard way. This Tuesday morning began like every other. Elias arrived at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her official start time, changed into her blue uniform in the basement locker room, and pulled on her gray work gloves with the quiet deliberateness of someone suiting up for something far larger than sanitation duty. She loaded her cart. She took the service elevator. She began on the 3rd floor. By the time the day staff filtered in at 7, she had already covered the east corridor, restocked 2 supply closets, and without stopping, without visibly slowing, read the medication summary on the chart outside room 304 from nearly 10 feet away and noted that the attending had miscalculated the morning diuretic adjustment by a factor that would matter by afternoon. She didn't stop. She didn't write anything down. She kept pushing the cart. At the nurse's station near the stairwell, a junior nurse named Priya was updating in 4 notation on a tablet, frowning at the screen with the concentrated uncertainty of someone second-guessing herself. Elias passed behind her. She didn't touch the tablet. She didn't pause. But as she moved by, she said, quietly and without looking up from her mop, "The decimal point. 2nd line." Priya blinked, looked at the screen, found it, corrected it. By the time she turned to ask who had spoken, Elias was already 15 feet down the corridor, her back to the station, the mop moving in slow, even arcs across the floor. This was how Elias Thorne lived inside the hospital that had been built with the money of the man who had taken everything from her. Carefully. Precisely. Always at the exact distance that allowed her to see everything and be required to say nothing. She had rules. She had kept them for 3 years without breaking once. Never engage the medical staff directly. Never let them see you reading their charts. Never let them see you calculating, because the moment they saw it, they would ask questions, and questions led to names, and her name led to a file that Maxwell Knight's legal team had spent a great deal of money burying. And never, under any circumstances, look at Dr. Julian Vane. Not because she was afraid of him. Because she knew that if she ever made direct eye contact with the man who had co-signed the institutional review that dismantled her career, she would not be able to control what her face did. And Elias Thorne had not survived 3 years of this by losing control of her face. She was on the 4th floor by 8:15, working the corridor outside the private wing, when the sound reached her. Not an alarm, something worse than an alarm. The specific, concentrated silence that falls over a medical team when confidence leaves the room. She stopped the cart. Through the reinforced glass panel of the private wing door, she could see the controlled chaos of a resuscitation in progress. She could see Dr. Vane. She could see the crash cart. She could see the monitors. And from where she stood, even through the glass, even at this distance, she could read the numbers. Her stomach dropped. She knew those numbers. She had seen that exact pattern in a dataset once, in her own data, in a study she had spent 4 years building, in the paper that had been pulled from the journal 3 weeks before publication and replaced with a retraction that bore her name but not her signature. She pressed one gloved hand against the corridor wall. The patient in that bed. She couldn't see the face yet. The team was too thick around the bed, too loud in their quiet, desperate efficiency. Then one of the nurses shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. And Elias Thorne saw the name on the patient board above the bed. Knight. Maxwell A. The mop handle slipped in her grip. Every rule she had made for herself, every careful, survival-tested boundary she had drawn and held for 3 years, began in that moment to crack. She stood there for 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Then Elias Thorne straightened her spine, picked up the mop handle, and did the most dangerous thing she had done in 3 years. She walked to the nurse's station and spoke. "Excuse me." Her voice was measured, calm. She kept her eyes on the counter and not on the ward beyond the glass. The patient in the private wing. I think there may be a problem with the current medication protocol. The ward nurse, a broad-shouldered man named Dennis whose lanyard identified him as senior staff, looked up from his screen with a particular expression reserved for people who have interrupted something important with something irrelevant. He looked at her uniform. He looked at her gloves. He looked back at his screen. "Thank you," he said, in the tone that means the opposite. Elias didn't move. The monitor readings, the pattern on the cardiac display. It's consistent with a compounding toxic interaction. If someone could check whether the patient is on any undisclosed supplements alongside the current. "Ma'am." Dennis set his pen down with deliberate patience. "Are you a doctor?" A pause that cost her something. "No." "Then I'm going to ask you to return to your section." She held her position for one more beat, long enough to make it clear she was choosing to leave, not being dismissed, and walked back to her cart. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She knew what she had seen. The cascade pattern on that monitor was not a standard cardiac event. It was a pharmacological collision, the kind that looked like heart failure, got treated like heart failure, and killed the patient while the team did everything correctly. She had mapped this exact sequence in 37 documented cases before Maxwell Knight's lawyers had ensured those documents ceased to exist. She pushed her cart to the far end of the corridor and stood with her back to the ward, breathing through her nose, doing the arithmetic she didn't want to do. If she walked away, Maxwell Knight would likely be dead within the hour. If she pushed further, she risked exposure. Her name, her history, the careful invisible life she had constructed on the ruins of everything he had taken from her. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back. This time she bypassed Dennis entirely and approached a younger nurse, a woman named Clara who Elias had watched for months and identified as someone who still asked questions before deferring to hierarchy. "Please," Elias said quietly, positioning herself so her body blocked Dennis's sight line. "I need you to look at the potassium sequence in combination with whatever he came in taking privately. I know how this looks. I know what I'm wearing. But I need you to check the supplement interaction before the next dosage cycle because if I'm right, the next cycle will." "Hey!" Dennis was already on his feet. "I told you once." "Clara," Elias said, holding the younger nurse's eyes. "Please just check. Security to 4th floor private wing." Dennis had the phone in his hand. His voice had gone flat and official. "Unauthorized personnel." Clara looked between them, apology already forming on her face, the particular apology of someone who might have listened in a different world, a world with different uniforms and different power arrangements. She stepped back. 2 security guards arrived in under 90 seconds. They were not unkind about it. That almost made it worse. They simply positioned themselves on either side of Elias, and the taller one said, "Let's go, ma'am," in the voice of someone who had done this before and would do it again and felt nothing about it either time. She let them walk her to the stairwell door. Because fighting it would end everything. Because the only move left required her to still be in the building. The stairwell door swung shut behind her. She stood alone in the gray echo of the service stairs, one hand flat against the cold painted wall, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that felt like despair. Then she pushed back through the door. She was not going to the nurse's station. She was not going to security. She walked directly to the corridor window, the long glass panel that ran the length of the private wing, and she stood in front of it and she looked through the glass at Maxwell Knight's bed. And Maxwell Knight, as if he had been waiting, turned his head. His eyes found hers through the glass with the precision of a man who had known exactly where she was the entire time. His lips moved. No sound reached her through the reinforced glass. But Elias had spent enough years reading things from distances that should have made it impossible. She read his lips. 2 words. Room 7. She had not always been invisible. There was a time, not so long ago that she had forgotten the texture of it, but long enough that it felt like another woman's life, when Elias Thorne walked into rooms and people stood up straighter. When her name on a research paper meant something. When she believed, with the clean and total confidence of someone who had never yet been shown otherwise, that the truth was the most powerful thing a person could carry. She had been wrong about that. She knew better now. 4 years before she picked up her first mop, Elias Thorne was the lead researcher on a pharmaceutical interaction study that nobody had thought to run before, not because the question wasn't worth asking, but because the answer was going to be expensive for the people with the money to fund it. The study was called the Karen Protocol. 17 months of data. 37 documented cases across 6 hospital networks. A pattern so clean, so consistent, so methodically evidenced that her faculty supervisor had read the preliminary findings and gone quiet for a long time before saying, very carefully, "Elias, you understand what this means." She understood. The Karen Protocol demonstrated that a specific class of potassium-sparing compounds that appeared in 11 of the most widely prescribed treatment sequences in private cardiac care, interacted catastrophically with a combination of 3 commercially available wellness supplements. The supplements were not prescription. They were not tracked. Patients took them at home and told nobody because nobody asked. And when the interaction triggered, it presented identically to acute cardiac failure. Doctors treated the cardiac failure. Patients died. Everyone did everything right. Nobody connected the dots. Elias connected the dots. She presented her findings at the National Clinical Research Symposium on a Thursday morning in March, wearing the good blazer she saved for the moments that mattered. The room was full. The data was irrefutable. The questions from the floor were sharp and serious and exactly the kind that meant people were paying attention. By Friday afternoon, she had received 3 calls expressing interest in publication. By the following Tuesday, she had received a letter from a law firm she had never heard of, representing interests she had never directly encountered, informing her that several elements of her research methodology were under formal review for ethical compliance violations. She had read the letter 4 times. Then she had called her supervisor. He didn't answer. He has not answered since. What followed was swift, total, and so meticulously legal that she had nothing to grip onto. No single outrage to hold up to the light. There was no villain with a smoking gun. There was only paperwork. Process. A compliance committee that met without her and reached conclusions without her and informed her of their findings in language so careful it contained no accusation that could be challenged and no admission that could be quoted. Her research license was suspended pending review. The review stretched to 6 months. Then 8. Then the journal that had been preparing her paper for publication issued a quiet retraction notice that bore her name but not her consent. Her institutional affiliation was terminated. The datasets, 4 years of her life, 37 cases, names and numbers, and the irrefutable architecture of her proof, were classified under a proprietary claim filed by the pharmaceutical subsidiary that had partially funded the hospital network. The subsidiary was owned by a holding company. The holding company was one of 14 under the umbrella of Knight Medical Investments. She had looked that up on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the floor of the apartment she was about to lose, her research files spread around her like wreckage after a flood. Maxwell Knight had not called her, had not written, had never once, in the entire elegant machinery of her destruction, allowed his name to appear anywhere near hers. That was the thing that kept her awake longest in those early months. Not the loss, the cleanliness of it. The way power, when it was large enough and careful enough, could dismantle a person without leaving fingerprints. She had spent 3 months trying to fight it, then 3 months trying to survive it. Then, in the gray exhaustion of the 7th month, she had done the only thing left to her. She had walked back into the building. Not to confront anyone. Not with a plan. Simply because Knight Memorial Hospital was where the patients were. And the patients were why she had started. And she was not ready, would never be ready, to let that be taken too. She took the janitor position under her mother's maiden name. She learned the corridors. She learned to be furniture. She told herself it was enough. For 3 years she had almost believed it. Room 7 was at the end of the 4th floor's private corridor, a consultation room used for family briefings, quiet enough, rarely monitored. Elias had cleaned it 40 times. She knew the camera in the corner had been angled slightly left since a maintenance error 8 months ago and had never been corrected. She pushed through the door at 9:04 a.m. Maxwell Knight was not there. But someone was. A man in a dark suit sat in the chair nearest the window. Not a doctor, not security, not anyone she recognized from the hospital's regular roster. He was holding a manila envelope. He set it on the table when she entered and slid it precisely to the center. The way people do when they want you to understand the gesture has been rehearsed. "Dr. Thorne," he said. Nobody had called her that in 3 years. The sound of it hit her somewhere she had thought was past feeling. "Mr. Knight would like to speak with you," the man said. "Privately. Before the next dosage cycle." He paused. "He says you'll understand the urgency of the timing." Elias looked at the envelope on the table. She looked at the man. She thought about 37 cases and a retraction notice that bore her name but not her consent. Then she thought about a cardiac monitor she had read through reinforced glass, and a pattern she knew better than her own heartbeat, and a man running out of time in the next wing who was, whatever else he was, still a patient. "When?" she said. The man checked his watch. "You have about 12 minutes before it won't matter." She had 12 minutes. She left the envelope on the table untouched and moved. Not running. Running drew attention, and attention drew security, and she had already used up her grace with the 4th floor staff. She walked fast, the way she had learned to walk in this building. Purposeful enough to look like she belonged somewhere, contained enough to look like that somewhere was nowhere important. The corridor outside the private wing was busier than she had left it. 2 nurses crossing. An orderly with a linen cart. Dennis still at his station. Head down, pen moving. She clocked all of it in under 3 seconds and kept moving toward the ward entrance. Through the glass she could see the monitors. She could see that she had less than 12 minutes. She could see she had less than 8. The numbers on Maxwell Knight's cardiac display had shifted in the time she had been in room 7. The cascade she had identified was no longer a prediction. It was in progress. The pattern was tightening, the exact compression sequence she had documented in Case 31, a retired banker in Abuja who had been dead for 4 hours before anyone thought to question the supplement intake form he had filled out in the waiting room and nobody had read. Her hand hit the ward door. "Hey!" Dennis was already on his feet. "I told you, you cannot." "His next dosage cycle will kill him," Elias said. Not loudly. She had learned that quiet certainty carried further than volume in a room full of people trained to respond to noise. The potassium sequence combined with the CoQ10 and the magnesium compound he takes at home. Look at the monitor. Look at the pattern. You have maybe 6 minutes before it becomes irreversible. Dennis came around the station. "I'm calling security right now." "Then call them." She held his eyes. "But look at the monitor first." 30 seconds. "That's all I'm asking." He looked. She watched his face. Watched the small, involuntary shift in his expression that meant the numbers had registered even if his training hadn't yet given him a framework for what they meant. That half-second of doubt was all she needed. She pushed through the ward door. The room met her like a wall of controlled panic. For medical staff, a crash cart that had been moved closer since she last looked through the glass, and Dr. Julian Vane standing at the foot of Maxwell Knight's bed with a tablet in his hand and the expression of a man recalculating in real time and not liking the results. He saw her. His face closed like a door. Get her out. He didn't look up from the tablet. Get her out right now. Two nurses moved toward her. Behind them, the primary monitor screamed a new alarm, a long, sustained tone that dropped the temperature of the room by several degrees. Everyone's eyes snapped to the display. The cardiac readout spiked, flatlined briefly, spiked again in the stuttering, irregular pattern that Elias had seen before and that the room was only now beginning to understand was not responding to anything they were doing. V-fib, someone said. Charging. Another voice, tight with urgency. Hold. Vane's hand went up, eyes still on the monitor, and for one suspended moment every person in the room was motionless, watching the line trace its terrible, erratic path across the screen. The line dropped flat. A nurse said something that wasn't a medical term. Vane set the tablet down. Slowly. The gesture of a man whose authority had just run to the edge of what it could cover. He looked at the crash cart. He looked at the team. He raised his hands, not in surrender exactly, but in the way a person does when they are about to say I don't know and are buying themselves one more second before they have to say it out loud. Into that second, from the bed, came a sound. Not an alarm. Not a machine. A voice, thin as paper and absolute. Let her speak. Maxwell Knight had not opened his eyes. His face was the color of old concrete and sheened with sweat, and the tears, she noticed them now, tracking silently from the outer corners of his closed eyes toward the pillow, were already there, as though they had started before any of this, as though he had been crying for longer than just a day. But his right hand had risen from the mattress. Barely. An inch. 2. The trembling hand of a man spending what might be his last reserves of will on a single, directed gesture. The room did not move. Elias walked to the bed. She did not look at Vane. She did not need to. She could feel his face from where she stood, the particular searing heat of a powerful man watching something slip past him that he cannot stop and cannot yet justify stopping, his credentials curdling in real time into something that looked, in this light, uncomfortably like ego. She reached the stand, pulled the medication log, opened it. The last cycle, she said. What did you administer at 8:40? Nobody answered. The monitor continued its flat, merciless tone. I need the 8:40 administration log, she said again, and this time her voice carried the specific frequency of someone who is not asking. And I need to know what he takes at home that isn't on this chart. Supplements. Anything. A junior nurse, Clara, from the station earlier, who had followed the commotion in and was standing nearest the door with wide eyes and good instincts, said very quietly, his aide brought in a bag this morning. Personal items. I put it in the cabinet. Get it. Don't touch that cabinet. Vane's voice, finally, sharp and recovered and dangerous. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Elias and the stand with the deliberate physical authority of a man reasserting the natural order of things. You are a hospital janitor. You are in a restricted medical ward. You have no credentials, no authority, and no business touching anything in this room. Elias looked at him. For the first time. Directly. Without the careful, protective avoidance she had maintained for 3 years. She let him see her face. All of it. Not the anger, which was old and cold and almost beside the point now, but the knowledge. The absolute, unignorable weight of knowing exactly what was killing the man in that bed and exactly how to stop it. You're right, she said. I'm a janitor. She reached past him and opened the cabinet. The monitor's flat tone cracked, one pulse irregular, desperate, and then resumed its terrible silence. Clara was already moving toward her with the bag, and Dr. Julian Vane, for the first time in a career built on the architecture of certainty, did not move to stop either of them. His face, in that moment, told everything the chapter needed to say. The bag contained 7 items. Elias laid them on the surface of the cabinet with the careful, unhurried movements of someone defusing something. A phone charger, a wallet, a folded handkerchief, a travel toothbrush, and 3 small amber supplement bottles, the kind sold in high-end wellness pharmacies, the kind that came with clean labels and reassuring language and no requirement to disclose to your cardiologist because they were, after all, just supplements. She read the first label. Then the second. On the third she stopped. "There," she said. Her voice was quiet. It always got quieter when the stakes got higher. She had noticed that about herself years ago, in a different life, standing in front of a different room, a lecture hall, not an ICU, but the same sensation of everything narrowing to a single load-bearing point. She turned to Clara. "I need the 840 administration record. The actual physical log, not the tablet. And I need to know the current potassium level from his last blood draw." Clara moved. No hesitation. Something had shifted in the room's gravity and everyone in it could feel it. That imperceptible but total reorientation that happens when competence enters a space that has been running on authority alone. "You cannot administer anything." Vane's voice came from behind her. Still sharp, but differently sharp now. Not the clean edge of command, but the jagged edge of a man watching his footing change beneath him. "Even if I allowed you to remain in this room, you have no license. Anything you touch becomes a liability. You understand that. Anything you do here." "I'm not going to touch the patient," Elias said. She turned to face him fully, the third supplement bottle still in her gloved hand. "I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. And you're going to do it. Because you're a doctor and I am not, and that distinction matters to me even if this moment makes it inconvenient for you." Vane stared at her. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took for him to understand she was not performing. Then she turned back to the 4 stand. "The magnesium glycinate in this bottle," she said, holding it up, "is dosed at 800 milligrams. He's been taking it daily, undisclosed. Combined with the potassium protocol you started at admission and the Coke 10 in the second bottle, which contains a compound that inhibits the same renal pathway your protocol relies on for clearance, you have created a serum accumulation that his body cannot process. It is not presenting as toxicity. It is presenting as cardiac failure because the accumulation is triggering a voltage imbalance across the myocardium that is clinically indistinguishable from V-fib without knowing the cause." The room was absolutely silent except for the flat, sustained alarm of the monitor. "The intervention is not complicated," Elias continued. "You need to suspend the current potassium infusion immediately. You need calcium gluconate, 10 milliliters, for push, to stabilize the membrane potential. Then a controlled saline flush to begin clearing the accumulated load. That's it. That is the entire sequence." Clara had returned with the physical log. She set it on the cabinet. Elias read it in 4 seconds, confirmed what she already knew, and set it down. She looked at Vane. He had not moved. His tablet was at his side. His face was doing something complicated, the internal arithmetic of a man measuring the cost of being wrong against the cost of admitting it, in a room full of witnesses, to a woman holding a mop handle 4 hours ago. The monitor screamed a new alarm. A second flatline warning, longer this time. One of the nurses made a small involuntary sound. "Dr. Vane." Elias kept her voice level. Not pleading. Not demanding. The tone of one professional addressing another across a distance that should not exist but does. "Calcium gluconate. 10 milliliters. Now." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. Just a small, almost invisible fracture. The kind that starts at the place where pride meets the unbearable weight of consequence. He turned to the crash cart. He drew the calcium gluconate himself. His hands were steady, she gave him that, he was steady, and he administered it with the clean efficiency of someone who knew exactly how to do the thing once he had been told what the thing was. Elias watched the monitor. 15 seconds. The room held its breath in collective, involuntary unison. Doctors and nurses and one janitor standing in a ring around a dying man, all of them watching the same green line trace its fragile, crucial path. 20 seconds. The irregular spiking began to slow. 25. The line smoothed. Not flat. Not spiking. Smoothing. Finding the rhythm of something that intended to continue. 30 seconds. A heartbeat. Then another. Then another. Clara exhaled first. Then the anesthesiologist. Then, one by one, the room began to breathe again like a single organism returning from somewhere terrible. Elias did not exhale. Not yet. She was still watching the monitor with the focused, unblinking attention of someone who knew that the crisis had passed but the consequences had not yet arrived. Maxwell Knight's chest rose and fell. Rose and fell. The color was beginning, slowly, tentatively, to return to his face. His eyes opened. He found her immediately, the way he had found her through the glass. Direct and certain, as though in all the noise and motion of the room, she was the fixed point he had been navigating toward. His lips moved. She leaned in close enough to hear. What he said was not thank you. It was not an apology. It was 4 words, spoken in the ruined, barely there voice of a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of everything and had chosen, as his first act of living, to say the most dangerous possible thing. Elias straightened. She stood very still. Behind her she heard the ward door open. She heard voices in the corridor, official voices, the kind attached to authority and badges and questions that did not come alone. She heard someone say her name. Her real name. Not Thorne. The other one, the one she had spent 3 years not being. She turned around slowly. In the doorway stood a man she recognized. Not from the hospital. From a photograph in a legal filing she had read so many times she could reconstruct it from memory. Maxwell Knight's chief legal counsel. Beside him, 2 men whose suits were too good for a hospital visit and whose expressions said they had not come to wish anyone well. Behind them, Dennis from the nurse's station was pointing directly at her. The monitor behind her continued its steady, living rhythm. The lawyers reached her before she could decide what to do about them. The taller one, gray-templed, precise, the kind of expensive that didn't need to announce itself, put a hand on her arm with the practiced lightness of someone who had learned that physical restraint looked better when it resembled guidance. "Ms. Thorne," he said, quietly enough that only she and the doorway heard it. "We'd like you to come with us." "She's not going anywhere." The voice came from the bed. It was not loud. Maxwell Knight did not have loud left in him. But it carried, the way a voice carries when a room has learned, over a lifetime, to stop and listen to it. Every head turned. The legal counsel's hand loosened on her arm by a fraction. Maxwell had pushed himself upright. Not far. His body was not yet cooperating with his intentions, but enough. Enough to make the gesture legible. A nurse moved instinctively to ease him back and he stopped her with a look. "Close the door," he said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Dr. Vane, who had not spoken since administering the calcium gluconate and had been standing at the periphery of the room with the expression of a man reassessing a very long list of decisions, reached back and closed it. The lawyers exchanged a glance. The taller one released Elias's arm entirely. The monitor behind her continued its steady rhythm. 40 beats per minute. 42. Climbing slowly back toward the living. Maxwell Knight looked at Elias Thorne. She looked back at him. This was the moment she had imagined 10,000 times in 3 years of corridor floors and supply closets and careful, strategic invisibility. She had built it differently in her mind each time, sometimes with fury, sometimes with the cold precision of a closing argument, once or twice, in the worst months, with something that frightened her because it had no words, only weight. It looked nothing like any of those versions. He looked old. That was the first thing. Not diminished. She had seen him diminished 20 minutes ago, and this was not that anymore. But old, in the way that crises strip the performance from a face and leave only what was always underneath. The lines around his eyes were deep. His hands, resting on the blanket, were the hands of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. He opened his mouth. She waited for the management of it. The careful, legally considered language of a man who had spent decades ensuring his words could not be used against him. Instead he said, "I know who you are." The room held. "I knew when they brought me in." His voice was unsteady, not from weakness, she realized, but from the specific unsteadiness of a person saying out loud something they have kept pressurized and sealed for years. "The night staff pulled my chart. My aide mentioned the attending janitor who had flagged a concern to the nurses." He stopped, steadied. There is only one person in the world who would look at a cardiac monitor from a hospital corridor and see what you saw. Elias said nothing. Her hands were still at her sides, still gloved. She was aware of the lawyers behind her, of Vane at the periphery, of Clara holding a chart she had stopped pretending to read. "The Karen protocol," Maxwell said. The words landed in the room like something physical. Elias felt her jaw tighten, felt the 3 years of it, the apartment floor, the retraction notice, the first morning she had put on the blue uniform and told herself it was temporary, rise in her chest like water finding a crack. "The Karen protocol," he said again, as though he needed to say it twice to bear the full weight of it, "was the most important clinical research I have ever read. I read it in full before my legal team filed the suppression." He paused. "I want you to know that. I want you to know I understood exactly what I was burying." The monitor beeped. Steady. 50 beats now. The body, indifferent to confession, continuing its work. "Then why?" Her voice came out less controlled than she intended. She stopped. "Rebuilt." "Why?" "Because it would have cost my company $4 billion and the careers of 11 executives and the quiet retirement of 2 people I owed debts I couldn't repay any other way." He said it without flinching, without the scaffolding of justification. Just the fact, bare and ugly, laid on the blanket between them. "I made a calculation. I have made a great many calculations in my life. That one." He stopped again. His eyes, she realized, were wet. Not filling. Already wet. Already past the point of filling, past the brimming, the tears already tracking silently down the sides of his face in the way she had noticed when she first reached his bedside, as if they had started before any of this. As if they had started sometime around the morning he learned his own heart was failing and found himself in a building that bore his name, being treated by doctors he had funded, in a ward he had endowed, completely and utterly unable to outspend what was happening to his body. As if somewhere in that helplessness, he had finally had time to think about a woman in a corridor. "That calculation," he said, "is why I am alive in a hospital right now instead of dead in a boardroom. Because the person I silenced was the only person who could save me." The tears ran freely now and he made no move to stop them. "I have thought about that. In the last 4 hours I have thought about very little else." Elias stood perfectly still. She had wanted this moment to feel like victory. She had wanted, in her worst hours, for it to feel like justice delivered, clean and final and proportionate to the loss. She had imagined his face and built it in her mind as a wall she could finally stop pressing against. It did not feel like that. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and being asked to decide, with no preparation and no precedent, what kind of person she was going to be on the other side of it. Maxwell Knight looked at her, not with the eyes of a powerful man managing a situation, but with something rawer and less defended than that. Recognition. The specific, shattering recognition of a person seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the full human cost of a decision they made in a room where the human cost was not present to be seen. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not asking for absolution. I am not, a breath ragged at the edges. I am not in a position to ask you for anything. You have already given me more than I deserve." The room was so quiet that the monitor's rhythm was the loudest thing in it. Elias looked at him for a long time. She did not answer the journalist immediately. She stood in the center of the room, gloved hands at her sides, blue uniform still carrying the morning's work, the ward's antiseptic air sharp in her lungs, and she looked at the woman with the press credentials the way she had learned to look at things that could destroy her. Carefully. Fully. Without flinching from what they were. "How did you get in here?" Elias said. The journalist, young, precise, the kind of focus that meant she had been working the story before today, held her ground. "Mr. Knight's aide made a call 40 minutes ago. To our editor." A pause. Apparently Mr. Knight made a specific request. Elias turned back to the bed. Maxwell met her eyes. He had the grace not to look apologetic about it. Just steady. Just a man who had made another calculation. This one, perhaps, in a different direction. "I asked her to come," he said simply. "Whatever happens next should happen in the open." The lawyers, behind Elias, said nothing. The taller one had his phone out. Whatever calls he was making now were different from the calls he had come here prepared to make. Dr. Vane had not moved from his place at the room's edge. He was watching all of it with the expression of a man watching the walls of a building he has occupied for years develop cracks he cannot explain and cannot stop. The journalist stepped further into the room. Her recorder was running. "Dr. Thorne, can you confirm your identity and your connection to the Karen Protocol Research Study?" And there it was. The name in this room, with a recorder running and witnesses on every side. The name that had been struck from journals and buried in legal filings and replaced with a retraction notice that still lived on 3 academic databases under her authorship like a scar. Elias looked at the recorder. She thought about the apartment floor. The legal letter. The first morning in the blue uniform when she had stood in the basement locker room and told her reflection that this was temporary, that she was not disappearing, that she was only going underground until she found a way back to the surface. 3 years was a long time to hold your breath. "My name is Dr. Elias Thorne," she said. "I was the lead researcher on the Karen Protocol. The study was suppressed in the 3rd quarter of 4 years ago through a legal action filed on behalf of Knight Medical Investments. The suppression was not based on methodological error. It was based on financial exposure." She paused. "I have documentation. I kept copies of everything." The room absorbed this. Clara, near the door, let out a slow breath. The anesthesiologist looked at his shoes. One of the junior nurses was recording on her phone, not secretly, openly, with the unambiguous body language of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for something worth recording. Vane's voice came from the periphery, thinner than before. "I had no knowledge of any suppression. My role was purely clinical." "Your role," Elias said, turning to face him with the full, unhurried attention she had withheld for 3 years, "included sitting on the institutional review committee that processed the compliance investigation against me. Your signature is on the secondary findings document. Page 4. 3rd paragraph." She watched him process this. watched the clinical composure he had maintained through the entire morning develop. Finally, the fracture it had been building toward since the moment she walked through the ward door. He started. "I'm not asking you to answer that now," Elias said. "Not cruelly. Just with the flat, final authority of someone who no longer needs the answer because the record already contains it. That's not my work anymore." She turned back to the journalist. "I'll give you a full statement." "Not here." She glanced at Maxwell, still upright in the bed, watching her with the exhausted, undefended attention of a man who has spent everything he had and is waiting to find out what it bought. Outside, she crossed to the cabinet, picked up the 3 supplement bottles and placed them carefully on the medical tray where they would be logged and documented and could not be made to disappear. She smoothed the medication log flat on the counter. She straightened the 4 lines she had been the one to correctly diagnose, in this room, without a badge or a title or anything except 10 years of buried knowledge and a refusal to let a man die because he had once chosen to let her career. Then she walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. But she spoke to the room, to Vane, to the lawyers with their careful suits and their recalibrating phones, to Maxwell Knight in his bed with his unchecked tears and his open, wrecked face. "The Karen protocol documented 37 cases," she said. 37 people who died of a condition that was entirely preventable. "I want their names in whatever comes next. Not mine. Theirs." She walked out. The mop was where she had left it, propped against the corridor wall outside the private wing entrance. Her cart beside it, exactly as it had been at 8:15 that morning when the world was still organized around her invisibility. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she leaned the mop handle carefully against the wall, not dropping it, not abandoning it, setting it down with the same deliberateness she had brought to everything she had done in this building, and she removed her gray work gloves. One. Then the other. She folded them neatly and placed them on top of the cart. She looked at her hands. Bare. The hands of a researcher. The hands of someone who had spent 3 years making herself small enough to survive, and had walked into a room this morning and saved a life with nothing but what those hands already knew. She walked to the service elevator, rode it to the basement, changed out of the blue uniform for the last time, folding it with the automatic, practiced neatness of long habit and placing it on the locker room bench. Underneath she wore a plain white shirt and dark trousers. The clothes of nobody in particular. The clothes of a woman who had not yet decided what she was going to be on the other side of today but had decided, with total and irreversible clarity, what she was not going to be anymore. She took the stairs back up. All 4 flights. She did not take the service entrance. She walked through the main lobby of Knight Memorial Hospital, past the reception desk, past the donor wall with its gilded lettering, past the enormous photograph of Maxwell Knight at the building's inauguration, smiling the smile of a man who had just put his name on something, and she pushed through the front entrance doors into the full, unfiltered light of the morning. The journalist was waiting on the steps with her recorder. Behind her, 2 more cameras. A gathering of people who had heard something on a scanner or a phone call or the particular frequency of a story breaking open in real time. Elias stopped on the top step. She stood in the light and she let them see her face. All of it. No maintenance lanyard. No gray gloves. No careful, constructed invisibility. Just Elias Thorne, standing in the morning with 3 years of corridor floors behind her and 37 names she intended to make the world remember. The journalist stepped forward. "Dr. Thorne, what happens now?" It was the right question. It was the only question. Elias looked out at the city, at the buildings and the traffic and the ordinary, indifferent morning continuing around a hospital where a man was alive who should not be, where a study was about to resurface that powerful people had paid a great deal to keep submerged, where a doctor with a signed compliance document was sitting in a wardroom calculating the distance between what he had done and what could be proven. She thought about Maxwell Knight's face when he said, "I knew exactly what I was burying." She thought about 37 case files in a suppressed database that she had kept copies of on 2 separate encrypted drives in 2 separate locations for 3 years, because she had known, not hoped, known, that this morning would eventually arrive. She reached into the pocket of her plain white shirt and removed a small USB drive. She held it up in the morning light where every camera could see it. "Now," she said, "we start with the data." Her phone buzzed in her other pocket. She glanced down. Unknown number. A text message, 4 words long, from a number she did not recognize but would later trace to a burner phone purchased that morning from a pharmacy 2 blocks from the hospital. She read it once. She read it again. The journalist was saying something. The cameras were running. The city was continuing its ordinary morning all around her. Elias Thorne stood at the top of the hospital steps in the full light with a USB drive in her hand and a phone screen that had just changed everything she thought she knew about what had happened to the Karen protocol. And who, exactly, had been watching her survive it. The 4 words on the screen were these: "He wasn't the only one."